Hello. Today I will take a look at a very famous game which was played in the Fischer Taimanov match exactly 45 years ago in the city of Vancouver. Um, so this was game 4 of the match, and by this time Fischer was already winning 3-0, so the match was kind of going his way. But this game became famous because it also illustrated um, his ability to create very instructive examples of endgame play, and it became also illustrative of his style, where he would prefer to have bishop against knight in simplified positions. So I'm gonna skip through the opening and get to this starting position of this endgame, where white has a rook and bishop against the black knight and rook. It seems like at the moment that black should be doing okay because his king is in the center, which is good for the endgame, and he doesn't have any terrible weaknesses, and his pieces are more or less able to join the play. But there are a couple of issues that still persist in black's position that allow white to play for an advantage here, and which Fischer really capitalized upon. So one advantage is that he has a bishop, and this becomes apparent after the next move. The issue is that this bishop is able to exert the pressure from the king side to the queen side. So even though the bishop now is placed on the king side, it can look at the opposite flank and attack the pawns there. So this already is posing the question to black as to how he's supposed to defend the pawn. So there's advantage of the bishop against the knight. There's also another issue that the white rook is already in the game, and it's also attacking a pawn here. So white's pieces are generally slightly more active. All in all, though, that should not necessarily have been enough to prove an advantage, because after all, black isn't losing any material by force, and he doesn't have any terrible weaknesses. But defense requires very accurate play, and only in analysis the grandmasters were able to show how black should have held on here. And Taimanov played a very natural move that anybody would play, I think, b6. It's natural because it defends both pawns, the c5 pawn and the b7 pawn. It couldn't be any more obvious that this move should be played. But it turns out that after b6 and the next move, bishop to f1, it turns out that another pawn has to go to the dark square, and now this bishop has a lot of really good diagonals, and in particular it can be placed on c4, and from here it will attack f7, and also these light squares will prove sort of like they will serve as entry points for the white king. So, and these pawns will not be able to advance any further, so they will turn into permanent weaknesses, which combined with others white's advantages will allow him to play for a win. So the subtlety that black missed here was that he could have actually played king to d6, defending the c5 pawn for now. The knight is guarding all the checks here in the center. So the most natural question then, of course, what happens if white takes? That runs into black regaining his material and not really having any problems here. And for example, in case of this, then the rook can come back and defend the pawn, and the material is even. The position is greatly simplified. The black got rid of the weak pawns that haunted him in the game. And after king d6, if white simply retreats, it turns out that the pawn can easily be defended. There's no issue whatsoever. Also, if white tries to fix the pawns on their weak squares, black is able to play b5, and then if white tries to get to the a6 pawn, then black has a nice defense against that. Here the knight goes to c7 and the bishop will be trapped, a bit like an in another famous Fischer game in the first game of his match against Spassky. But this didn't happen anyway. And after King E5, after Rook E5 and B6, White starts to build up the pressure, and it's really awkward to face it. Basically, with this move, he cuts out the squares from the black knight. So this is typical in terms of how you should play against a knight. If you have a bishop, you take away all the outposts from that knight. If White accidentally played pawn to c4 and Black put the knight on d4, he would be just fine, maybe even better. But with this, of course, this is ruled out. So knight to c6, rook e3. There's no hurry. The rook is tied to the defense of the f pawn. That's very important. And then with a4, White makes sure that the b pawn never advances. And now gradually White begins to advance on the king side. So now with pawn to h5, this is a new weakness that White will immediately switch his attention to. The trick here for White is to play on two flanks, and this is how he managed to win this game. So after f5, defending the h5 pawn, and also hoping to get rid of the weakness on f7 so that the rook doesn't have to be stuck on f8. It's a very natural move, and it could be a mistake, but there really wasn't a much better way otherwise, since after g6, for example, White could just continue with f5 and further exerting pressure on the black king side. So after f5, now the e-file square, like the key squares on the e-file have been weakened, so now White switches to the e-file with a rook, threatening to come in with maybe rook e8, start to put the pressure on Black this way. So Black covers up, now White just waits. With the rook to e3, he is contemplating at some point switching to d3. A very instructive moment here. In general, White doesn't mind swapping rooks, and so that he can then transfer with the king to the to the queen side pawns via these light squares. But instructively, this wasn't yet the right time to do this, because here it turns out that Black is able to set up a nice fortress with the knight, for example, like this, and basically he would then take away all the light squares through which White was hoping to invade through, and that would be a fortress. There's nothing White can even try to do here. In case with b4, Black would just ignore it altogether, and there's no Zugzwang possible because the Black king has plenty of moves. So because of that, Fischer waits with the rook to e2, with king to e2, and now that the Black king has taken the square d8 and the knight can't go there, so it can't be transferred to d6, now Fischer goes into the simplified endgame, and now he swaps rooks. Now he threatens to invade with the king. There are all these options at different time to exchange on c6. The Black has to calculate, so he retreats with the knight. Now the bishop comes to e8, and this illustrates what type of problems Black is facing here. There are weaknesses here, and there are weaknesses here. The king will attack b6, the bishop will keep an eye on g6. At some point, Black would not be able to defend the weaknesses on both flanks. This is how White's going to win. But this takes a lot of technique and patience. For now, White's fighting for the invasion square, so now the king comes. Black is covering up c6, but then another check, and now b5 is available. Of course, a lot of attention is still required, because now if, say, White carelessly takes on g6, then he would get checkmated. So instead, he doesn't take the pawn yet. He continues with bishop to c6. The king retreats, and now he transfers the bishop to d5. A very nice centralized square. Now Black king or knight have to guard b6, so he releases the knight, but then after this regrouping, White is still threatening to either invade to a6 or at some point force black into Zugzwang, which is he kind of is in now. A waiting move. A few more waiting moves. And now the king comes to a6. So now, of course, moves like knight to c6 would probably be answered by exchanging, and because of the active placement of the white king, the pawn endgame is going to be winning for white. Instead, he tries to hold on with this. A few more waiting moves. And this is the decisive Zugzwang. The black king is tied to the defense of the b pawn. The black knight is tied to the defense of the g pawn. There are no more pawn moves. If the pawn goes to c4, white will then just retreat and pick it back up. So something has to give. So black moves the king, seemingly with tempo, but here comes the long planned bishop sacrifice. And of course, black has to take this because otherwise all his kingside pawns fall. So he takes, and now we have an endgame where for now white has only 2 pawns for the knight, but it's clear that both c5 and a5 pawns are going to fall. 3 passed pawns on the king side, on the queen side, no counterplay on the king side that black could possibly come up with, and the rest was relatively simple. White didn't even try to win the a5 pawn, he just exchanged it and started to march forward with the pawns. A bit of calculation was required to make sure that if black takes on g3, then the a pawn would promote easily. There isn't really much to calculate. Say takes, pawn goes, king goes, the pawn goes. It's going to promote with check. So back to the main line after king c8. White's still playing for the advancement of his pawns, and this is how he won the game, because the pawns are just going to promote. The black knight is completely restricted, and this is how Fischer won the game. This was game 4. In game 5, I think Taimanov blundered the rook in an equal position, and then the last game was just kind of also going downhill for him, and Fischer won the match 6-0. But this really was the game that kind of re-established Fischer's superiority in this match, and it also became very famous because of the quality and instructiveness of this plan of playing with the bishop on 2 flanks. That's why this game became famous. Thanks for watching.